From battling the Romans to playing a crucial part in the military achievements of the British Empire, the Scots have long been considered some of the finest warriors in Europe. But not all their history is simply martial, and the Scots have nonetheless endured many other hardships during their long and storied history, ultimately culminating in them arguably being one of the most crucial people groups that formed the world as we know it today. But where did these Scots come from, and what has happened to them throughout their fascinating history? Those are the questions I'm going to be answering in today's video, so without further ado, let's get straight into it. The first permanent human settlements in Scotland we know of came during the Neolithic era, which was marked by the introduction of farming across much of Europe, replacing the previously hunter-gatherer lifestyle with one much more settled down. The first hard evidence of such inhabitation in Scotland can be dated back to about 3600 BC in the form of what is believed to have once been a large timber-framed structure in Aberdeenshire. Further evidence of these changes in Scotland include well-preserved stone houses found all around Scotland, including even the Orkney Islands, dating from around 3500 BC. These new settlers, who are believed to have arrived from Central Europe before making their way through the British Isles up to Scotland, introduced chambered cairn tombs, a form of ancient burial from about the same time period, with them further going on to begin creating standing stones and circles somewhat similar to those at Stonehenge from about 3000 BC. The building of such structures continued into the Bronze Age, which began in Scotland in about 2000 BC. The Bronze Age, similarly to elsewhere in Europe, brought hill forts to the country from about 1000 BC, with the greatest example of these defensive works being at Eildon Hill near Melrose in the Scottish borders, which is believed to have accommodated several hundred houses on a fortified hilltop. The construction of these continued well into the Iron Age, with there being evidence for about 1000 hill forts in Scotland during this period, with some archaeologists believing that this is evidence of the emergence of a society of petty rulers and warrior elites. Another crucial change to Scotland came during this period, as it is believed that sometime after the 8th century BC, Brythonic Celtic culture and language first began to spread into southern Scotland, possibly through cultural contact rather than mass invasion, though it is unclear. Regardless of how the Celtic peoples made their way into Scotland, they greatly changed both the cultural and ethnic makeup of the land, and soon began to form a sophisticated system of kingdoms in the area, laying the foundations of how the land would become during the time of the Romans. The first surviving written references to the land we'd now call Scotland come from the Greek Pytheas of Massalia, who may have circumnavigated the British Isles and Ireland sometime around 325 BC, with the understanding of the British Isles as a whole by the Greeks and Romans continuing to improve throughout the coming centuries. This knowledge, as well as the full conquest of northern Gaul by about 50 BC, resulted in the Romans beginning a full-scale invasion of Britain in earnest in 43 AD, where they quickly overcame the southern parts of the island. After consolidating their power in the south for a few decades, the Roman governor, Quintus Petilius Cerealis, launched an invasion of what is now Scotland by the year 71 AD, though this was met with little success, and in the year 78 AD, Gnaeus Julius Agricola was appointed as the new governor of Roman Britain, and shortly after his arrival began a series of his own major incursions into the north, following the construction of forts and supply lines in Cumberland and Durham. The new governor managed to push his armies up to the rivers Clyde and Forth, where he established a temporary frontier. In the year 84, he further advanced into Caledonia and won a victory against the Picts at Mons Gropius, the exact location of which is unidentified. High off these victories, he even dreamed of invading Ireland, believing it would be an easy task, which he prepared for by conquering southwestern Scotland, with forts being built in Argyllshire, Dumfriesshire, and Kirkcudbrightshire. By the completion of his incursion, his permanent occupation of Scotland enveloped Strathmore, a large valley in central Scotland, stretching from southwest to northeast through the counties of Perthshire, Angus, and Kincardineshire. Unfortunately for the Romans, Agricola's successors were either unable to or unwilling to further subdue the far north, and by the year 87, the occupation was limited to just the southern uplands near the border with England. Come the end of the 1st century, the Romans had been almost completely forced out of Scotland, with a new line being drawn between the Tyne and Solway Firth in far northern England. The Roman line finally solidified itself in what is now northern England after the Romans constructed what is now known as Hadrian's Wall from coast to coast, beginning in about 122 AD. Some decades later, around the year 141, under the rule of Emperor Antonius Pius, the Romans undertook a reconquest of southern Scotland, eventually moving up to construct a new defensive line between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde in central Scotland, which became known as the Antonine Wall. Though as remarkable, if not more so than its southern counterpart in terms of defences, the Antonine Wall, which had taken 12 years to build, was eventually overrun and abandoned soon after 160, with the Romans falling back to the line of Hadrian's Wall once more. Over the coming years, Roman troops continued to attempt to establish control in modern Scotland, with at least 4 major campaigns being fought, though by the year 210 they had all proved fruitless and the Romans once again withdrew south to Hadrian's Wall, where the frontier of the empire would remain until the Romans finally withdrew from Britain altogether by the early 5th century, which in turn resulted in the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain, primarily England, which in turn resulted in the Anglo-Saxon settlement of Britain, though the influence of these migrations was minimal in Scotland, with the presence of these new Germanic peoples only being felt in the southeastern coast of Scotland and no further. By this time, the Picts, who are believed to have been descendants of the Caledoni, had become dominant in northern Scotland, with various other Brythonic tribes inhabiting the southern half of the land. Also around this time, significant societal changes began occurring in Scotland, with the slow arrival of Christianity throughout the course of the 5th and 7th centuries, largely thanks to Irish Scots missionaries such as St. Columba. In addition to this new religion, the arrival of such missionaries may have sped up the long-term process of Gaelicization of the Pictish kingdoms, which during this period began adopting Irish Gaelic language and customs. Additionally, there was also a merger of the Gaelic and Pictish crowns, although historians argue over whether it was a Pictish takeover of Dalriata, located in western Scotland and Northern Ireland, or the other way around. Either way, this takeover culminated in the rise of the man who is now known as Kenneth MacAlpin in the 840s, who then went on to conquer the kingdom of the Picts in 843 to 850, followed by a campaign to seize all of Scotland and assimilate the Picts. He fought the Britons of the kingdom of Strathclyde, as well as the newly arrived Viking invaders, and eventually managed to form the kingdom of Alba, a name which was later replaced with Scotia and then Scotland. The rulers of this new joint kingdom continued using the title King of the Picts until the reign of the great-grandson of Kenneth MacAlpin, Donald II, who was the first man to be named the King of Alba. Donald II's own son, Constantine II, is often regarded as the key to formation of the Kingdom of Alba during his over 40 years reign, and was later credited with bringing Scottish Christianity into conformity with the Catholic Church of mainland Europe. Another notable thing that happened during his reign is that following one of what will become many conflicts with England, between an alliance of himself, Olaf Guthfrithson, the Irish Viking King of Dublin, and Owain, King of Strathclyde of southern Scotland, against the king of the newly unified England, Athelstan, the somewhat reluctant allies were eventually defeated at the Battle of Brunanburh, in an exceptionally bloody battle that was recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as "never yet as many people killed before this with sword's edge, since the East Angles and Saxons came up over the broad sea. Indeed, even one of Constantine's sons is said to have been killed in the battle, which created somewhat of a succession crisis in the aftermath in Alba. As though Constantine had not yet died, by this time he was in his late 60s or 70s, while the kingdom needed a strong and capable ruler. The death of Constantine's elder son in the battle meant that his obvious successor was impossible, and while he did have a surviving son named Indolf, he was too young to be a candidate for the kingship, probably only being in his early teens during the early 940s. With these factors in mind, Constantine's obvious heir was his nephew Malcolm, who, while also not being especially young, was probably in his mid-40s and thus more capable than his failing uncle. And so it came to pass that in 943, Constantine officially abdicated in favour of Malcolm, who just 2 years later managed to obtain the kingdom of Strathclyde, largely in southern modern-day Scotland, as part of a deal with King Edmund of England. Things were far from perfect in Alba though, as during this time intense internal divisions began showing, which reached a peak during the reign of Malcolm I's grandson, Duncan I, from 1034 onwards, who, following a largely martial reign, was eventually defeated and killed by Macbeth, the leading noble of Moray, who subsequently became king himself in 1040. Macbeth ruled for 17 years before he was overthrown by Duncan I's son, the future Malcolm III, who was further forced to defeat Macbeth's stepson and successor, Lulac, some months later before his throne was finally secured. For his efforts, Malcolm III acquired the nickname Canmore, or Great Chief, which he passed to his successors, who eventually went on to cement the new Dunkeld dynasty that ruled Scotland for the following 2 centuries. Unfortunately for him, the remainder of his rule would not be purely peaceful, as his reign overlapped with the arrival of William the Conqueror in England, who, following Malcolm III's raids on northern England and crucial second marriage to the Anglo-Hungarian Princess Margaret of Wessex, decided to invade, forcing Malcolm into submission with the Treaty of Abernethy, opening up Scotland to later claims of sovereignty by English kings, which will become important a little later on. Though peace had officially been secured with the treaty, it was an uneasy one, as Scotland still laid claim to the counties of Northumberland, Cumberland, and Westmoreland. These tensions eventually boiled over once more in 1093, when following failed negotiations over Cumbrian territories with the new King of England, William the Conqueror's son and William Rufus, Malcolm invaded northern England once again and besieged Alnwick Castle. However, they were surprised by a relief force led by the Earl of Northumbria, with Malcolm and some of his sons being killed in the subsequent Battle of Alnwick. The deaths of Malcolm and his sons saw more chaos erupt in Scotland over the succession. As though he was initially succeeded by his brother Donald III, the King of England supported Malcolm's son by his first marriage, Donchad, who seized power with English backing. Not long after his ascension to the throne, just a few months after in fact, Donchad was then murdered, resulting in Donald taking the throne again, with one of Malcolm's surviving sons by his second marriage, Edmund, as his heir. These two ruled Scotland for a few years until two of Edmund's younger brothers returned from exile in England, and again, with English backing, triumphed over their elder brother and uncle, with Edgar, the eldest of these three, becoming king in 1097, finally bringing this period of complete and utter chaos to an end. Edgar was peacefully succeeded by his brother Alexander in 1107, who was in turn succeeded by their youngest brother, David I, in 1124. The reign of David saw what has now been named the Davidian Revolution, in which many Anglo-Norman followers of King David he had obtained during his first time in exile in England were granted lands and titles, and intermixed their institutions with those of the Scots, while also intermarrying with the existing aristocracy, a development which would prove to have a large effect on the formation of later medieval Scotland. Notably, David's followers introduced a system of feudal land tenure to the pre-existing Scottish aristocracy, which produced the system known as knight service, as well as castles and an available body of heavily armed cavalry. David himself also created a style of court akin to those found in the rest of Western Europe, and further established the first royal burghs in Scotland, granting rights to particular villages and towns, ultimately leading to the development of the first true Scottish cities. He also continued a process begun by his mother and brothers with the aim of reforming the Scottish monarchy and strengthening and stabilising its control over the country. These reforms, which were further continued by his descendants, most notably brought the Scottish monarchy a direct line of succession which had previously been a little bit murky and not set in stone, a fact which was largely to blame for much of the dynastic chaos mentioned earlier. This new line of succession, much like most of Europe during this time, was male-preferred primogeniture, meaning sons would have preference over any daughters, however women could still inherit if there were no direct sons. These new policies did much to strengthen and solidify Scotland's monarchy, with these benefits being taken full use of by Alexander II and his son Alexander III, who during the 13th century pursued a policy of peace with England in order to expand their authority in the Highlands and Islands. These efforts would eventually bear fruit, as by the reign of Alexander III, the Scots were in a position to annex the remainder of the western seaboard, which they promptly did following a failed invasion from a king of Norway known as Hakon Hakonarson and the subsequent Treaty of Perth in 1266, in which Scotland was granted possession of the Hebrides and the Isle of Man, while also confirming Norwegian sovereignty over Shetland and Orkney. Despite the Scottish monarchy's relative stability in the preceding decades, all this would come crashing down following the death of the King Alexander III in 1286, and the death of his granddaughter and heir 4 years later in 1290, who was tragically just 7 years old at the time of her death. Following the deaths of these two important figures, Scotland was on the verge of civil war, with 14 powerful nobles claiming the kingship. To prevent yet another period of chaos in Scotland, the Scottish magnates requested Edward I of England, otherwise known as Longshanks, to arbitrate. This move ultimately proved to not be the wisest, as Edward went on to extract a legal recognition that the realm of Scotland was held as a feudal dependency to the throne of England, essentially making it subservient to England, before deciding that John Balliol, the man with the seemingly strongest claim, would become king, doing so in 1292. This decision unsurprisingly did not sit well with all the Scottish lords, with Robert the Bruce, the next strongest claimant, feeling particularly bitter towards the English king. Over the course of the next few years in Scotland, Edward I used his newly acquired power over the country to systemically undermine both the authority of King John and the independence of Scotland. It was in response to this that in 1295, John, following the advice of his chief councillors, entered into an alliance with England's longtime enemy, France, known as the Auld Alliance. Edward then used this alliance with the French as a pretext to invade Scotland, doing so in 1296, quickly subduing the Scots and forcibly deposing King John in July, following the brutal sacking of Berwick and the Scottish defeat at the Battle of Dunbar. By August, Scotland was more or less completely conquered, with Scottish nobles paying homage to Edward as king. Over the course of the next few months, anti-English sentiment and resistance slowly grew, led by the now famous William Wallace, a knight's son, in the absence of a leader from the more powerful magnate class. A full-scale revolt eventually broke out in the following year of 1297, where the Scots defeated the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where the Scots were outnumbered 2-1. Following this victory, Wallace actually ruled Scotland for a short time in the name of King John as guardian of the realm. Edward's wrath would soon hit Scotland once again, however, with his exploits and arguably crimes against the Scots, earning him the further nickname of the Hammer of the Scots. Following Edward's personal arrival in Scotland, Wallace and his fellow Scots were decisively defeated at the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, though Wallace himself managed to escape English capture. Wallace would unfortunately not be able to escape capture forever though, and he was ultimately turned over to the English on the 5th of August 1305 by John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who was loyal to Edward. Interestingly, letters of conduct from Haakon V of Norway and Philip IV of France, alongside other documents, were found in Wallace's possession, suggesting he had been in those countries at some point during the previous 7 years, with there being some evidence he had gone to France in an attempt to gain French support against the English during that time. Regardless of what he had been up to, following his capture, Wallace was transported to London and taken to Westminster Hall, where he was tried for treason, a charge which he adamantly denied, stating that unlike most of the other Scottish leaders, he had never sworn allegiance to Edward, so therefore how could he be a traitor or guilty of treason against him? Interestingly, he was also charged with committing atrocities against civilians in war, sparing neither age nor sex, monk nor nun, which was a bit hypocritical coming from the English, especially after their brutal sack of Berwick, where thousands of civilians were said to have been slaughtered, including women and children. But nevertheless, it is one of the earliest examples of what would now be considered prosecution for war crimes. William Wallace was unsurprisingly found guilty, and following the conclusion of his trial on the 23rd of August 1305, he was taken to the Tower of London, where he was stripped naked and dragged through the city at the heels of a horse before he was hanged to within an inch of his life, had his male parts cut off, disemboweled with his bowels being burned before him, after which he was at this point mercifully beheaded, with his body then cut into 4 parts. Afterwards, his head was dipped in tar and placed on a spike atop London Bridge, with his limbs also being put on display separately in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. Following the horrific execution of Wallace, rivals John Comyn and Robert the Bruce, the grandson of the initial claimant of the same name, were appointed as joint guardians of Scotland. They did not remain joint for long though, as Bruce went on to murder Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk or Church on the 10th of February 1306. Less than 7 weeks after this, Bruce was crowned as king, though Edward's forces quickly overran the country and defeated his army at the Battle of Methven. Bruce managed to avoid capture and execution, however, and despite the fact he had been excommunicated by the Pope for obvious reasons, since he just murdered one of his rivals in a church, his support in Scotland slowly strengthened, and by 1314, following the death of Edward I in 1307, he had slowly retaken control of Scotland, with the help of leading nobles, with only the castles of Bothwell and Stirling remaining under English control. Following the Scots' subsequent siege on Stirling Castle, Edward I's heir, Edward II, moved an army north in order to reassert control. However, Robert defeated the army at the incredibly impressive Battle of Bannockburn, where the Scots had been outnumbered roughly 4-1, with 5,000 to 8,000 Scots facing off against 20,000 to 25,000 Englishmen. This victory gained the Scots de facto independence, and in 1320 the Pope was eventually convinced to overturn his earlier excommunication of Robert and nullify the various acts of submission by Scottish kings to the English, so that Scottish sovereignty could be recognised by Europe's major powers. The solidifying factor in this independence came in 1328, when Edward III of England signed the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton, officially acknowledging Scottish independence under Robert the Bruce. However, 4 years after Robert's death in 1329, England once more invaded under the pretext of restoring Edward Balliol, son of John Balliol, to the Scottish throne, thus starting the Second War of Independence. These efforts were met with fierce Scottish resistance though, and eventually Edward III lost interest in Scotland following the outbreak of the 100 Years' War in France, and in 1341, David II, King Robert's son and heir, was able to return from a temporary exile in France, and following some controversy and potentially questionable decisions I will not be diving into here for the sake of brevity, secured the throne of Scotland for himself. David II would die unexpectedly in 1371 at age 46, leaving behind no children, with the throne then passing on to his nephew by his sister, who would become known as Robert II, marking the beginning of the Stuart dynasty. A bit more political chaos ensued over the next few decades of the Stuart dynasty, involving assassinations, exiles, and a bordering on state of civil war, which eventually culminated culminated in James II, the great-grandson of Robert II, asserting his control over the country and securing his family's position following the assassination of his father in 1437, notably weakening the great noble families of Scotland in the process. It would be under James II's son, James III, that the final significant change to Scotland's territory came when James III was engaged to Margaret of Denmark and received the Orkney and Shetland Islands as part of her dowry. Things would not remain so good for long though, and before long internal division returned once more to Scotland, with numerous rebellions against the rule of James III breaking out, with his teenage son being perhaps reluctantly used as the figurehead. These rebellions eventually culminated in the Battle of Sorcheburn on the 11th of June 1488, where James III was killed at some point during the battle, though the exact circumstances of his death are unclear, with his son, soon to be James IV, then ascending the throne with the backing of the rebel lords who had risen up against his father. James IV, despite the difficult circumstances of his ascension, is actually considered to be the most successful Stuart monarch, being responsible for, among many other things, a major expansion of the Scottish Navy, as well as the proper integration of the Western Isles, which until this point, despite being nominally a part of England, had acted essentially independently. Crucially for the future of Scotland, in 1503 he also married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, thus laying the foundation for the later union of the Scottish and English crowns. Unfortunately for James IV though, fate would have it that he, like his father, would meet a violent end, this time fighting the English rather than Scottish rebels. This happened when in 1512 the old alliance between France and Scotland was renewed. It was under these terms that following the French being attacked by the English under Henry VIII, James invaded England in support. This invasion of England was stopped decisively at the Battle of Flodden Field, where the king, alongside many thousands of his soldiers and most of his commanding nobles, was killed, with his body being found the following day, identified by 2 Scottish prisoners of war. It was seen that James's lower jaw had been pierced by an arrow, an injury which it is thought would have disabled him enough for the attacking English soldiers to move in and slash him with their bills, almost severing his left hand and slicing his throat open in the process. Following this disastrous battle for the Scots, the throne passed to James IV's infant son, James V, who was crowned at just 17 months old in late 1513. James V, after escaping the control of the regions at the age of 16 in 1528, continued his father's policy of subduing the rebellious Highlands, Western and Northern Isles and the troublesome borders. He also continued the French alliance, marrying the French noblewoman Madeleine of Valois, and then after her death, Marie of Guise. Almost comically at this point, England and Scotland would once again beat each other's throats under his reign, when he refused to break from the Catholic Church, as urged by King Henry VIII of England, who was actually his uncle, further insulting and enraging his uncle by refusing to meet with him at York, presumably to discuss the matter. In response to this perceived insult, Henry sent an army into Scotland, which soon after resulted in the disastrous Battle of Solway Moss, where the exceptionally poor led and organised Scots suffered a significant defeat, with hundreds of soldiers actually drowning in the River Esk and many more being captured, all at the expense of just 7 English killed and 20 Scots in actual combat. It is believed to be the news of this complete disaster that hastened the premature death of James, who died a short time later at the age of just 30, due to what contemporaries called a broken heart, though it is now believed it is more likely he died from cholera or dysentery. The day before his death, he was brought the news of the birth of an heir, a daughter who would become Mary Queen of Scots. This resulting in, following his death, Scotland once again being left in the hand of regents. Just 2 years later, yet another conflict broke out between England and Scotland, in which Henry VIII attempted to force a marriage between Mary and his son Edward, which after his death culminated in forces under the English regent Edward Seymour, 1st Duke of Somerset, being victorious at the Battle of Pinkie Cleugh, followed by the English setting up an occupation of parts of Scotland and the now 5-year-old Mary being sent to France as the intended bride of the heir to the French throne. Her French mother then called on French troops for assistance, who strengthened resistance against the English occupation, and by 1550 the English were forced to withdraw from the country completely. A few years after this, in 1554, Mary's mother, Marie de Guise, took over the regency and continued to advance French interests in Scotland. However, anti-French sentiment began to grow significantly for the first time in Scotland during this time, particularly among Protestants who saw the English as their natural allies, despite all the wars that had been fought between them. This led to a small-scale conflict, and following the death of Marie in June 1560, the old alliance was officially ended shortly after, with the signing of the Treaty of Edinburgh, which also demanded the removal of French and English troops from Scotland. Importantly, the Scottish Reformation took place just a few days later, when the Scottish Parliament officially abolished the Roman Catholic religion. As for Mary, she returned to Scotland in 1560 at age 19 to take up government, which she promptly did. Despite being Catholic herself, she did not make any attempts to reimpose the religion on her largely Protestant subjects, which angered the chief Catholic nobles. Her 6-year reign, like a lot of Scotland's history it seems, was marked by a series of crises, mainly due to the rivalries and ambitions of the leading nobles, most notably including the murder of her secretary, David Riccio, followed by that of her unpopular second husband, Lord Darnley, as well as her abduction and eventual marriage to the Earl of Bothwell, who had actually been implicated in her second husband's murder. Bothwell was soon embroiled in conflict with other nobles though, and following his defeat, Mary was imprisoned in July 1567 and forced to abdicate in favour of her infant son James VI. She eventually escaped, and following a failed attempt to regain her throne, took refuge in England, where she became a focal point for Catholic conspirators, and was eventually tried for treason and executed on the orders of her relative Elizabeth I of England. Back in Scotland, things eventually calmed down a bit as James VI grew up and eventually inherited the throne of the Kingdom of England, uniting England and Scotland under a single monarch, though the crowns remained distinct and separate in everything else. The new king also acquired the Irish crown during this time, by way of the English one, which resulted in around 50,000 Scots settling in the area of Northern Ireland known as Ulster in the mid-17th century. During this time, Scotland also attempted to establish colonies in North America, such as Nova Scotia, which just means New Scotland in Latin. However, these attempts were largely unsuccessful due to a lack of funds and/or willing colonists. Back in Scotland though, James had made attempts throughout his reign to get the Scottish Church to accept some of the Anglican methods and teachings of the English. However, he was met with limited success. His son, however, decided to take these matters further when he took the throne, and began introducing an English-style prayer book into the Scottish Church in 1637, resulting in anger and widespread rioting in the country. The new Charles I then seemingly doubled down and made matters worse in the November of that year, when at a meeting of the General Assembly in Glasgow, Scottish bishops were formally expelled from the church, which was then established on a fully Presbyterian basis. These matters remained unresolved until 1640, when in a renewal of hostilities, Charles's northern forces were defeated by the Scots at the Battle of Newburn to the west of Newcastle, in a conflict that became known as the Bishops' Wars. Charles then attempted to raise an army of Irish Catholics, but was forced to stop following an eruption of protests in both Scotland and England against the notion. The backlash from this actually went on to provoke a full-scale rebellion in Ireland, with Charles then being forced to appeal to the English Parliament for funds, which the Parliament resisted, demanding reforms in England to limit the King's power, which eventually resulted in the English Civil Wars that engulfed England, Scotland and Ireland in the 1640s and 50s, and went on to cause over 200,000 deaths, of which around 85,000 were soldiers, eventually culminating in the execution of Charles I in 1649, with his son thereafter immediately being proclaimed as King Charles II in Edinburgh. This caused the victorious parliamentarians, led by Oliver Cromwell, to invade Scotland in 1650, to root out any royalist uprising in Scotland, which had been known to have strong royalist sympathies. Unfortunately for the royalists, the Scottish army was defeated at Dunbar, with the Scots defeated again the following year by Cromwell at Worcester, following an invasion of England. These defeats allowed Cromwell to emerge as the leading figure in the English government, and Scotland was occupied by an English force under George Monk, with the country then essentially being incorporated into the English domain. The parliamentarians would not hold England forever though, as following Cromwell's death the regime collapsed, which was followed by the restoration of Charles II in 1660, with Scotland once more becoming an independent kingdom as a result. Religious tensions between England and Scotland continued though, leading to a period known as the Killing Time in the late 17th century, when the English kings attempted to crack down on Scots leaving the official church and setting up their own illegal field assemblies. Initially, these attempts led to an uprising in 1679, which was defeated by James, Duke of Monmouth, the king's illegitimate son, and was then followed by the aforementioned Killing Time a few years later. Matters came to a head in Scotland once more when Charles II died and was succeeded by his brother James VII in 1685, who escalated the situation. Following his ascension, James put Catholics in key positions in the government and made attendance of those aforementioned field assemblies punishable by death. He further disregarded Parliament and forced through religious toleration to Roman Catholics, as unlike his brother and father, was himself openly Catholic, alienating his Protestant subjects. These questionable decisions ultimately led to the almost bloodless Glorious Revolution, when, at the invitation of 7 leading Englishmen, William of Orange, Stadtholder of the Netherlands, landed in England with 40,000 men, forcing James to flee and ceding his throne. Strangely enough, despite William's supporters dominating the government, there remained a significant amount of support for James in Scotland, particularly in the Highlands, with this cause becoming known as Jacobitism, which would go on to cause many more conflicts throughout the next few decades. After initial setbacks, Jacobitism actually saw a resurgence when one of the most important events in Scottish history took place, being the official union of Scotland and England under one crown, then known as Great Britain, ruled by Queen Anne in 1707. Despite being supported by many Scots, the union still faced a lot of resistance in Scotland, which allowed the Jacobites to continue attempting to seize the throne numerous times throughout the course of the 18th century, with the final of these uprisings finally coming in 1745, though it failed to gain much traction and resulted in the Jacobite cause being extinguished once and for all. Following the demise of Jacobitism, Scotland quickly became a crucial part of the growing British Empire, with many middle and upper class Scots seizing the chance to become entrepreneurs, intellectuals and soldiers. Scottish soldiers were particularly appreciated by the British government, which I think is best shown in a quote from the Secretary of War in 1751, who said, "I am for having always in our army as many Scottish soldiers as possible, because they are generally more hardy and less mutinous." Back in Scotland, critical changes to their society were also well underway during this period, with the collapse of the clan system which had previously dominated much of the Highlands. Following the aforementioned failed Jacobite rebellion in 1745, the clans realised they no longer had the power or authority to raise large bodies of fighting men at short notice, as they had during the failed rebellion, and previously. These circumstances resulted in most of the clan chiefs essentially transitioning into commercial landlords in the Highlands. This change went on to give rise to the first phase of the Highland clearances in 1750, where many tenant farmers in the area were evicted and forced to resettle elsewhere, which unfortunately accelerated the decline of the Scottish Gaelic language, as many Gaelic-speaking Highlanders were forced to move into non-Gaelic-speaking parts of Scotland, where the language often didn't survive past 1 or 2 generations. As Scotland moved into the 19th century, like elsewhere in Europe, literature, education, philosophy and other such things began to flourish in the country, with the nation also seeing the beginnings of industrialisation during this period. By the turn of the century, Scotland was already one of the most urbanised and industrialised areas in Europe, with the industrial belt running across the country from southwest to northeast, heavily fueled by the natural resources of iron and coal. While these industrial developments brought work and wealth to the nation, it must be said that for a time they were so rapid that housing, town planning, and public health services simply couldn't keep up, resulting in the living conditions in some towns and cities being notoriously bad, with overcrowding, high infant mortality, and growing rates of tuberculosis early on. It wouldn't be accurate to say that the benefits of industrialisation were felt equally throughout the country, however, as the Highlands during this period remained quite poor and traditional, with a handful of powerful families owning large amounts of land and essentially controlling the region in all aspects. This way of running things would end up bringing about a lot of hardship for the ordinary people of the Highlands, as particularly following the Napoleonic Wars, these families required significant amounts of cash to maintain their positions in London society, and had less need of soldiers, which had been a primary occupation for the Highlanders. In search of this money, these families, of essentially landlords by this period, increased money rents, displaced farmers to raise sheep, and downplayed the traditional patriarchal relationship that had sustained the clans. To make matters worse, the potato blight reached the Highlands in 1846, where 150,000 people faced disaster due to potatoes making up a large portion of their diet, and were only rescued by an effective emergency relief system. As the famine continued, landlords, charities, and government agencies provided assisted passages for tenants to emigrate to Canada and Australia, essentially paying them to leave, with an excess of 16,000 people choosing to do so, most in 1851, with this period generally being considered the second phase of the Highland clearances. It wasn't only Highlanders who decided to immigrate, however, as Scotland as a whole saw an exceptionally high immigration rate during the mid-19th century and beyond, largely due to there not being enough good jobs in the country. From the years 1841 to 1931, it is believed that about 2 million Scots emigrated to North America and Australia, among them actually some of my own ancestors who arrived in Australia around this time, with a further 750,000 Scots also relocating to England. These exceptionally high immigration rates actually meant that perhaps as much as 30% of Scotland's natural population increase was lost to immigration from about the 1850s onwards, limiting the country's population growth and meaning that almost every family had lost members due to immigration. Interestingly, many of these Scottish settlers played a leading role in the foundation and development of the countries they settled in, with even one of Australia's first prime ministers post-independence, who led the country through the first year of World War I, Andrew Fisher, being Scottish-born. Today it is thought that between 28 to 40 million people worldwide have Scottish ancestry, with 5.4 to 6 million in the US, almost 5 million in Canada, and over 2 million in Australia. Back in Britain though, in the years leading up to World War I, the Scots continued to be greatly overrepresented in terms of politics, military, and governance of the empire, with many Scots holding high positions in their respective fields. When war came to Europe in 1914, the Scots would, in light of this information, unsurprisingly play a crucial role, supplying a significant amount of manpower, ships, machinery, food, and money towards the war effort. With a population of 4.8 million in 1911, Scotland sent 690,000 men, or 25% of the eligible population, to fight, with some areas seeing that number as high as 50%. Of these men, 74,000 would be killed in the war, with a further 150,000 seriously wounded. These high recruitment rates amongst the Scots can be partially attributed to Scottish urban centres, with their relatively high levels of poverty and unemployment being a favoured recruiting grounds of the regular British Army, with Dundee in particular having one of the highest proportion of reservists and serving soldiers than almost any other British city. This poverty was double-edged though, as concern for their family's standard of living initially made many men hesitant to enlist. However, voluntary enlistment rates saw a sharp increase after the government guaranteed a weekly stipend for life to the families of men who were killed or disabled in the conflict. After conscription was introduced into Britain in January 1916, the entire country was affected, unfortunately resulting in many men being forced into service. All these factors resulted in the end fact that although Scots only made up 10% of the British population, they made up 15% of the armed forces and eventually accounted for 20% of the dead, with some areas like the thinly populated island of Lewis and Harris suffering some of the highest proportional losses of any part of Britain. Additionally, it is also thought that between 20 to 25% of officers in the British Army were Scottish, though they suffered heavy losses, particularly among the junior officers, who often led from the front. One of the more positive effects of the war was that Scotland saw a bit of an economic boom due to the increased demand for shipbuilding and similar wartime needs, which persisted until even a few years after the war ended in late 1918. This boom wouldn't last forever though, as serious depression hit the economy starting about 1922, with the most skilled workers being especially hard hit as there were few alternative uses for their specialised skills. In saying this though, a few industries continued to grow, such as chemicals and whiskey, with the latter of those developing a global market for premium Scotch. In general though, the economy was in a poor state, leading to growing unemployment and widespread political discontentment among industrial workers. This discontentment was so severe that many of the upper and middle classes in the country feared a Bolshevik revolution, with this fear being fueled by the emergence of a radical movement led by militant trade unionists in a time period known as Red Clydeside. Despite this, the Reds continued to operate within the larger Labour Party and had little influence in Parliament. After many years without progress and heavy unemployment, the once politically active moods of many workers switched to one of despair during the late 1920s, resulting in far fewer riots, strikes, and that sort of thing. These factors, in combination with a few others, such as a desire for travel, personal links into, and the basic cultural similarity to the US, Canada, and Australia, due to the many Scots who had previously settled in these areas, resulted in Scottish immigration continuing strongly into the interwar years, with 400,000 Scots, or 10% of the population, estimated to have left the country between 1920 and 1931. A state of affairs that stands in contrast to England and Wales, where immigration had begun to tail off following the First World War. These wayward Scots were assisted by government subsidies as they had been in the past, with another encouraging and assisting factor being the personal connections of family and friends many of them had, some of whom had sent money back home to their loved ones or otherwise heavily encouraged them to join them. Emigration from Scotland only began to settle down once and for all following the hit of the Great Depression in the 1930s, which meant there were no easily available jobs in those once heavily desired nations, with the number of Scots leaving falling to less than 50,000 a year, bringing an end to the period of mass immigration that had characterised Scotland since the mid-18th century. When war eventually came to Europe once more in 1939, With the outbreak of the Second World War, the Scots once more heavily contributed to the victory the British would eventually obtain, with their shipyards and heavy engineering factories in particular being key to the British wartime industry. In addition to this, it was also a Scot, Robert Watson Watt, who invented the radar, which proved invaluable during the Battle of Britain, with another notable Scot being Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, who has similarly been credited with playing a critical role in Britain's defence. Scots also continued to be overrepresented in the military as they had in the First World War, making up 10% of British soldiers and 15 to 20% of the officers, despite only being 8 to 9% of the British population, with about 50,000 Scots losing their life in the conflict by the time it was all said and done, including both soldiers and civilians. Following the end of the war and the Allies' victory, despite the extensive bombing by the Luftwaffe Scotland had endured, the Scottish industry actually came out of its depression slump and saw a dramatic expansion of its industry, with the real wages adjusted for inflation rising 25% during the post-war period, and unemployment temporarily vanishing from the country. This increased income and more equal distribution of food, obtained through a tight rationing system that was in effect throughout Britain, dramatically improved the health and nutrition of the average Scot, with the average height of 13-year-olds in Glasgow increasing 2 inches during these years. This economic boom was unfortunately short-lived though, and following this, Scotland's economic situation became progressively worse due to overseas competition, inefficient industry, and industrial disputes, a process which only began to change in the 1970s due to the discovery and development of North Sea oil and gas, and partly as Scotland moved towards a more service-based economy. This period also saw the emergence of the Scottish National Party and movements for both Scottish independence and, more popularly, devolution, which would have given Scotland more autonomy within the UK, but remain as part of it. A referendum on devolution in 1979 was unsuccessful as it did not achieve the support of 40% of the electorate. However, in 1997, Scottish voters voted in favour of establishing a Scottish Parliament, which was established in 1998, thus reforming Scottish devolution. More recently, in 2014, the independence referendum saw 55% of Scots vote against independence, choosing to remain in the UK for the time being. I don't wish to make my comments section a war zone though, so I think I'm going to end the video there before I talk too much about modern politics. This was another very long video, and I know it is slightly late, so I do apologise for that. However, if you enjoyed it regardless, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content from me. With all that being said though, if you're still here, you're an absolute legend, and as always, I hope you all have a great day, night, wherever you are, and I hope to see you all in the next one.